Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, fortunately, I get to work from home most of the time, so my basement here. But essentially, right now I perform web app pen testing. So what that means, basically, we get companies to pay us to test the security of their websites. Professional hackers, Silent Break Security has been around for a while, and was created by an ex-DoD, ex-NSA employee. He ended up doing network assessments first. He's really good at breaking into networks. And his sales pitch to every company when he started out was, if we can't get in, you don't have to pay us. So that's kind of been our motto going along with everything that we do at Silent Break. We're pretty dedicated to finding all of the critical vulnerabilities that exist within networks, within web apps, and I also do iOS and Android app pen testing. So probably some that you've heard of. I'm not at liberty to say who all of our clients are and which apps we actually test, but I guess first of all, I'd like to, let me share my screen here. But I'm sure that there's probably a variety of knowledge or skill levels out there when it comes to security testing. But probably the biggest resource out there for web security is the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, which is, there's a group that kind of runs this. The first introduction that I had to web security was when I was at the Department of Defense. I took a web pen testing class, and it was taught by the vice president of this group. They make a lot of different tools for web pen testing. One of their main tools that they have for practicing how to do web pen testing is called WebGoat. If any of you have an interest in learning how to do web pen testing, I would recommend downloading WebGoat. They have it as a standalone jar file. They can run, it basically just runs on your local host. You have to be kind of careful when you're running it though. You might not want to be connected to the internet because it actually does have some remote code execution vulnerabilities in it that can, if somebody were able to access it, they could execute code on your box. So got to be a little bit careful with it, but basically the OWASP top 10, this is stuff that, you know, I find vulnerabilities on websites all the time with these. This is the 2017 project. These 10 haven't really been accepted yet. There are people that are arguing against 7 and 10, but they released these in 2010, 2013, and they're trying to get the 2017 ones done. It probably won't happen until 2018. But essentially, I'll just go through each one of these briefly. Injection, this is talking about SQL injection. So as you guys have been learning about web programming, one of the things that typically every application has is some sort of a backend database. Whether that's SQL or whether it's NoSQL, typically you have to store information. Unless the site is completely informational, there's really no dynamic content in it, but pretty rare that we see things like that. So the injection is, you can inject SQL into, say, a search query. So let's say you have an application and you have a search field, and when you put in your search, it has something like this. I don't know, can you guys see? Can you see this okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so essentially this is an example where you would select star from accounts, where the customer ID, and then you put in your parameter, right? And then let's say I inject something into there. Well, I could inject another SQL statement in there that would pull out something more. I could do a union on a different table, pull out information. I'm actually testing a site today that has this vulnerability in it in their login form. to where I can put in a single quote and then say, or 1 equals 1, or, you know, another string, and essentially concatenate an additional query into the parameter, and I can pull out the entire database, basically just from adding in SQL statements. So it's pretty common, and it's really a severe vulnerability. We find it actually a lot more frequently than I would hope, because this has been a known issue for a really long time. There's lots of libraries to use. You can see here that the references, they've got SQL injection prevention cheat sheets. Depending on which language you're using, typically you want to use parameterized queries. And I mean, if you don't know what those are, this is definitely a time to look into it. The one thing I will say is that we do trainings for companies for their developers. We've got some companies that have hundreds of developers for sites that we test. And problem is, basically they've got so many that if you train all of your existing programmers, then you hire a few more, and those guys haven't been trained, then they work on a page that they introduce a vulnerability like this, then the whole site gets compromised, right? So I'm sure most of you have heard about the Equifax breach. Pretty much everybody's heard about it. It's a big deal because hundreds of millions of people's personal information was compromised. Well, one of the ways that that happened was, let's see, the security misconfiguration, and then using components with known vulnerabilities. That's number 9. The vulnerability that was exploited for Equifax was an Apache struts vulnerability that allows remote code execution, which allows somebody to gain a shell on the web server. So basically, the problem is that Equifax has some sort of a process set up where they can scan their websites for different libraries, and they were supposed to have scanned all of them, and they missed the one where this vulnerability existed. Their scanners didn't pick up that they were using the vulnerable library, and therefore they didn't patch it. Because they didn't patch it, and because it's publicly known vulnerability, somebody out there went to the site and exploited it, got a shell on the box, and was able to basically take all of the records from the database in the application. So, I mean, that's this one. This was the Equifax breach. Broken authentication and session mismanagement. I mean, this one, unfortunately, I see fairly frequently as well, is when you're authenticating someone. If you're using a single page application, then typically you have to store some sort of either a token if you're not going to use an authorization cookie. And I had one site that I was testing. It was a payment site, kind of like PayPal. I'd actually never heard of it before I started testing it, but it was a Ember.js application, and in Ember they were storing all of the users' session information in local storage, in the browser's local storage. And they had a persistent cross-site scripting vulnerability, which is this third one. Cross-site scripting is essentially where you can inject JavaScript into the application to where it will execute when you view a page. So there's reflected, which is if I can phish you, I can send you an email that contains JavaScript in it. Then I get you to click on it. When that URL loads, it will actually put that JavaScript into the page. Let me show you a quick example of that. There's a guy, this Brute Logic. He's Brazilian. He works for security, and he's really, really good at doing these cross-site scripting attacks. This is his blog. It's brutelogic.com.br, and he's got these 7 main cross-site scripting cases everyone should know. These are really interesting because he's got test sites that you can actually go and you can test these out on. So for example, this site here is vulnerable to cross-site scripting. So this URL, if you put this in, I don't know if this shows up as well, so I'd like it to, but if I put this in, just visiting the URL, it pops this alert 1, but this alert 1 here can be replaced with any JavaScript you want. And that JavaScript gets inserted into the application. So if you actually look at the page source, this, let's see where it got. So here, this form, you can see that it actually just got stuck right in the form itself here because we broke out of these double quotes. And that's what we call reflected cross-site scripting. If you get anybody to visit this URL, you could technically put anything in here. You could put document.cookies, right? And it will show your cookies. So if you have session cookies in there, then it could pop up their session cookies and display them. You could send those session cookies to an external web server where you could collect them. And I mean, if you guys know how authentication cookies work, if I have your session cookie, I can log in as you. All I have to do is go into my browser and change my session cookie to your session cookie, and all of a sudden, I've got access to your account. So anyway, this payment site that I was testing, they had persistent cross-site scripting. The site essentially allows somebody to create an invoice, and in the invoice, I could attach a file, like a PDF, but the file name itself was vulnerable to this type of cross-site scripting where I could insert like a single quote or a double quote, and then it would break out to when the actual invoice was viewed, it would insert JavaScript into the page that would execute. And now this particular application, they were storing all of the session tokens and all of the user's information in the local storage. And so basically what I did is I put persistent cross-site scripting into an invoice and then sent it to another user. And what would happen is if that user viewed the invoice, I could do anything I wanted that you could do with JavaScript, which, as you should be finding out, you can essentially do everything possible on the application that a user could perform. Every action that a user could perform, you can perform that same action just using JavaScript. So what I did is I had it automatically pay me, right? So as soon as they viewed the invoice, they didn't have to pay me. It would just take money from their account and put it into my account. And so stuff like that, we find pretty consistently, and cross-site scripting has always been one of the top vulnerabilities just because it's so prevalent. Now React actually has built-in protections for cross-site scripting, and you have to specifically tell React that you want it to you want to put HTML on the page. I'm trying to remember what it's called. There's a specific term for it. It's like allow, let me see, dangerously set inner HTML. You actually have to specify that specifically in React, which is really nice. But if you ever work somewhere where they're not using React everywhere, this is very, very common to see. And these are pretty risky because you can essentially do anything at that point. You can forward people onto different sites, you can collect credentials, you can send their authorization cookies to yourself. So anyway, I don't know how much time do we want to have for questions? Should I open it up now?
If you feel like there's anything more that you want to say, usually when people present, they go for kind of however long it takes to get the information across, and then field questions as we go. So really, it's up to you. If you feel like there's anything anything else. So maybe you could just answer this question that I have. Which would be a better protocol or practice, using JSON Web Tokens or like sessions in your application?
So JSON Web Tokens, it's interesting because there have been multiple attacks against JSON Web Tokens specifically. So for example, when you use a JSON Web Token, you have to specify an algorithm that it uses to perform the encryption. And they had a vulnerability where you could set the algorithm to none, which is part of the spec for JSON Web Tokens. And for several years, I guess, they had a problem where if I could get that JWT, or if I could create the rest of it, the part that it really isn't encrypted, it's just base64 encoded. So typically JSON Web Tokens, they have 3 separate parts that are separated by periods. And the first, technically all 3 parts are base64 encoded, but that third part is an actually encrypted string, and it uses a specific algorithm to do that. And so the problem is that you could change that JSON Web Token to use an algorithm of none, and then leave that third section blank, and it would accept it as a valid token. And so that's one of the vulnerabilities that they've had. They've had other ones in the past. I know that they fixed some of the problems with it, but they do end up sometimes containing information that is sensitive, that shouldn't be able to be seen. And those JSON Web Tokens, because they're not fully encrypted, because the first 2 sections, which you can actually pass parameters in, they're only base64 encoded. Sometimes people put information in there that shouldn't be in there. And so that's also an issue that I've seen with JWT. But the last couple of companies that I've tested that have been using it, they've actually done it right. And it's worked really well for them. So I think if you're going to do a non-cookie based authorization, then JWT is a good way to go.
Cool. Yeah, we definitely we have a couple of labs where the students do some session authentication, and then some they use JSON Web Tokens as part of like an extra credit portion. So definitely something we cover a lot, which is pretty fun. So cool. That's partially why I asked, because there are students who literally worked on this stuff like last week. So it's fun. Okay, so a couple of questions here. And I'll just kind of start at the top of the list that I have been sort of keeping track of. So, somebody asked, how do you actually go about this process, like to break into a site? And you kind of showed us a little bit, but if you were to get like just google.com as a client or whatever, what would you start to initially do, I guess, as you would look for a vulnerability? What's the first place here?
So this application that I've got up right now is called Burp Suite. And Burp Suite is kind of the tool for web pen testers. You can buy it. It's somewhat expensive. It's like $350 for a year, which for security software is really cheap. So there are other ones out there that are a little more automated, and they cost, $5,000 to $10,000 a year for a license. But this one, you can actually get a free version. So Burp Suite is run by Portswigger, and you can get a free trial. Well, there's a free version of it. It doesn't have all of the features of the professional, but it actually has a lot of features that it has more features than most free software. Let's put it that way. So Burp Suite is a great tool because it's a proxy. So when you actually perform requests, you can see the request, what the request is doing, what it's sending, each of these parameters, and then what the response is. And you can actually modify these in transit. So let's say I go to the intercept and I turn the intercept on, and then I open my browser here, and then I want to, make a request. The proxy will actually intercept this request, and I can change this data, And so when you submit, say, a login form is typically a post request, and they will have some variables down here of like what you're submitting, and you can modify those. And technically what you can do is you can actually, they've got this tool called Intruder, and you can clear these out, and you can actually say, okay, I want to try a bunch of variables. I just want to repeat this request a ton of times, and I want to send in like a bunch of cross-site scripting requests. And then you say, all right, go. And essentially what this will do is it will repeat that request over and over while changing that one parameter. And it will show you the responses, so you can actually like view the response for this application itself. And you can see how the different values that you're sending in that particular parameter change the response of the application. So like this one is a bad request. It's got other ones that have like bigger length, right? Longer length responses. And what I typically do, so like for say a login request, if I send a login and it says, and I look at this response completed column here, it shows this in milliseconds of how long a response takes to complete. And I actually, so I've written, let me see, I've got, let me pull up this, our site. I've written some blog posts on different vulnerabilities. So like this username discovery, this is a good one. I talk about how I can use server response times to identify different types of user accounts. So this one in particular was actually using an auth-bearer token that's essentially, it's the username colon password, and then you base64 encode it and you send it in a header. And so I chose a lot of different usernames, and then I sent them to the server in an authentication attempt. And here you're seeing the output of that burp intruder, and you see this response completed column. These are the usernames here. These ones all took an exceptionally long time to respond. And then this kind of a middle section where it went from like 358 to 534, these accounts were all admin accounts on the site. And then the ones that took less time than that were actually all valid accounts. I had a list of usernames for this site and their roles that I found with another vulnerability. But when I was actually testing this, you could see that there was a pretty big variation in response times. And I see this very, very frequently because typically an application that performs a login, you send it the username, and typically what happens? I mean, you get the username and you perform a query into your database and say, okay, does this username exist in our system? If it does, pull out the password hash and then compare the password that they sent in their login request with the password that's in our database. If it matches, then respond. If it doesn't, whatever. So the fact that, let's say your logic is grab out the username, make a query in the database. Does it exist? No, it doesn't. Immediately return. That takes not very long to say, does a username exist in our system? Now, if it's then going and querying the password and then doing a check on the password to see if the one they submitted is the same, then the server takes a different amount of time to respond to that type of request. And so typically we see this to where these numbers are kind of reversed. This one took longer for invalid ones, but typically valid usernames take longer to return. And now, okay, so this is cool, right? We can see what usernames have been registered in the application, but so what? Like, what does that matter? Well, there's plenty of passwords out there, right? They've been breached from LinkedIn, from Adobe, from MySpace, from all kinds of different sites. And we have kind of a subscription to a service where we get access to those credentials, like clear text passwords from password dumps. And we will run those on companies that our clients, and typically people reuse their passwords. So we end up getting access to a lot of different accounts using, say, the password of password or password123, or ones that have been leaked in database breaches in the past. The site that I'm testing right now, honestly, we're testing probably 6 different sites with different login portals, and we've been able to log into all 6 with company employee credentials that have been leaked over the past 8 years. We get into a lot of networks that way too, because their Active Directory is typically available online somewhere to do these password checks. But I mean, I usually test the login portal first when I start testing a site. So if there is authentication on the site, I start testing the portal. I had one time where I discovered all these usernames, and then they have a I forgot my password link, which typically most sites do. So I clicked, okay, I forgot my password. It says, put in your username. So I put in the username, and it says, okay, answer your security questions. I didn't know what the security questions were for the user because it wasn't my user account. And so what I did is I just browsed to the URL for viewing a user's profile. Well, the application just browsed right to the user's profile. I hadn't answered the security questions at that point, but it was a flaw in their logic because it had kind of authenticated the user by me inputting a username that existed on the system. It gave me like this partial authentication, which allowed me to view the user's profile page, which had a change my password feature on it, and it showed me all the answers to their security questions. So either I could just reset their password automatically, or I could actually enter in the valid security questions because it gave me access to it. So I typically test the login first. I'll throw a scanner at it. NetSparker is a scanner that is pretty good in my estimation of scanners. Burp Suite actually has a scanner functionality to it as well, that you can get a little bit more targeted in your scans. So if I wanted to scan this, I would just say actively scan this host, or I could specifically actively scan the defined insertion point, and I can actually choose what types of scans I want to do, like file path traversal, stored cross-site scripting, server-side code injection. There's a ton of different types of checks that it does, and you can get very specific in your scanning. But most of the time, these scanners will pick up on a lot of the common vulnerabilities. But when you get good, when you actually get somebody to manually pen test your site, they're looking a lot more for logical flaws that an automated scan can't pick up on. And so that's kind of where I view the value of a manual pen test, because some things a computer just doesn't know if it's risky or not. And so that's where a human has to make that determination.
That's awesome. That definitely thoroughly answered that question. That was really good. So definitely just for like being able to see kind of how like cross-site communication works, that seems like a really cool app to download and play around with the free trial at least. So a lot of questions coming in, and this one seems to have a lot of responses and a lot of people upvoting it. So I'm going to move this one to the top real quick. So for those of us starting out in this field who know nothing about code security, are there any best practices that we should follow as we learn that would help us to avoid security issues such as these down the road?
Yes. So pretty much every platform, every programming language has security libraries, and most of them will be listed on the OWASP website. They've even created their own, but you should always use security libraries when you're doing outputting to a page. If you're reading in variables, Java specifically has a lot of deserialization vulnerabilities that if you don't pass it through a security library first for filtering, then you can end up getting remote code execution on your server. So there are a lot of best practices when it comes to security, and that's actually why I'm really glad to be able to do this for your students, because we do trainings for companies all the time, and I think part of the issue that we see from our end, from the security side, is that a lot of the focus goes into teaching people how to program at all, right? Make the code work. But in the end, if your code works, isn't enough. It also needs to be secure. And so, fortunately, I guess for you guys, you focus on React, right?
More or less, yeah.
Right. So React has a lot of security features built in, which a lot of libraries and platforms are building a lot of security in because of these issues. But I'd say if you don't know anything about security, you should at least go and look at the top 10 on the OWASP for sure, and like read through those pages to see what they are. Because when you get out into the industry and you're programming, a lot of companies are going to actually have automated security checks on your code, and you won't even be able to commit the code unless it can pass security checks. And so you may get the security guys coming to you and saying, why are you trying to have this SQL injection in our site? Your code is crap. From a security standpoint, it might work really well, but from a security standpoint, you're introducing vulnerabilities, which, I mean, we look at the Equifax one and it's $1 million, millions of dollars, and people are getting fired over it. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. It's definitely is something we could teach like an entire like course on. I feel like it'd be super fun.
Oh yeah, you could.
A couple of questions that I feel like are also being repeated. How does one go about like getting started in the pen testing world?
So what I would suggest, there are bug bounty programs. HackerOne is a company that has a bunch of companies basically sign up to be part of a bug bounty program. I repeat, I would not just try to go out and start hacking websites. Definitely not. That can get you into a lot of trouble, into litigation trouble. HackerOne, bug bounty forums, SYNAC. I'm a member of the Red Team SYNAC, but you actually have to apply for that to be accepted. But there are a lot of these crowdsourced programs, which are open bug bounties, that you could become a part of. And at that point, they actually list what companies have signed up to have people pen test their sites. And when you find a vulnerability, you can report it to them and they'll pay you for it. SYNAC that I'm a part of, they actually pay pretty well. I mean, the few vulnerabilities that I've submitted, probably on average, I've gotten $500 per vulnerability, which is a lot more than a lot of the open bug bounties. But once you get to kind of a higher level, then you can get into some more of the more selective programs. But if you're really just wanting to start out and see how everything works, I would suggest downloading WebGoat, which is the OWASP. It's a specifically vulnerable web application that you can run on your own machine. And it has tutorials. It says, here's a cross-site scripting page. This page is vulnerable to cross-site scripting. And if you can't figure out how to exploit it, then you can click give me a hint. And it'll give you a hint. And then if you still can't get it, you say give me another hint. So there's different applications out there like that will give you very specific guidance on how to perform these attacks, which really helps when you're trying to learn how to defend.
Cool. Do you have any thoughts on OAuth?
OAuth is great. Same thing that I would say about JWT is OAuth has had vulnerabilities in the past where Its parsing wasn't correct. I mean, there's people that have done white papers and presentations on different OAuth vulnerabilities. It typically works pretty well. Honestly, most of the sites that I test that use OAuth, I haven't really found any major issues with it as long as they're using up-to-date libraries. If you use older versions that have known vulnerabilities, then that can be an issue. But typically, as long as you're using the latest of everything, then it works great for single sign-on.
Cool. Are there best practice apps, etc., that will help us to sandbox apps we create in order to make them less vulnerable for like Linux, Windows, or Mac, BSD, etc.?
So there's what they call WAFs, web application firewalls, and they put like a barrier in front of your application that prevent a lot of attacks, and a lot of companies will do that as like a second measure. But honestly, a lot of the frameworks that are out there right now have security features built into them, and they have security libraries specifically made for them. I think what I would suggest is just whatever one you're using, whatever platform you're using, whatever language you're using, research the security libraries and make sure that you're using them, because there's plenty of libraries out there for all of these languages that we use, but who knows what they are. Most of the time there's tons and tons and tons of them. If you don't know the right libraries to use, then you're kind of hosed. So do the research to know what security libraries you should be using in your web app development.
Cool. I think I'm just going to take a couple more, and then our TA, lead TA Ty, had a question for you as well. This one says, it'll be obvious where you're getting hit from, though without a VPS or proxy in play. What kinds of signs can we find that our host has been attacked by a baddie?
So you can monitor your logs. So your database logs, like logins, and then different queries that are being run. So like SQL injection, they typically, the one that I'm doing right now is considered blind. So let's say I make a query and it says, I'm injecting into like select star from users, right? And then I say select star from users where username equals Dan, and then I can inject in there to say where username equals Dan or A equals A. And if the server comes back with the same page, like a normal response, then I know that that query resolved to true. But if I say where username equals Dan and A equals B, and then the server throws an error, then I can infer that the application is evaluating my SQL query, even though I'm not actually getting data back. But for example, this one that I'm doing right now on the site, it's actually running on my other VM. It takes a really long time because essentially I have to say, what is the first character in the table name? In this table name, is it A? Is it B? Is it C? Is it D? And if it comes back with an OK response on the D, but it came back with errors on the A, B, and C, then I know that the first character in that table name is D. So those queries, those will add up. If you look in the logs, you'll see hundreds of thousands of queries with like clearly SQL injection in them. Honestly, there's some sites that I test that show me the logs and I can see the SQL injection attempts, and sometimes I've looked in their logs and seen that somebody else has been doing SQL injection just by looking at the logs from what I can see on the web app. Also, just you may get phished for your own site. Be careful when you click on any link that somebody sends you, because a lot of these attacks require phishing to work. Cross-site request forgery is something that we didn't really talk about, but it only works if you get phished, and it works works because you are authorized in the application. But yeah, I would say definitely check your logs. And then also, if you see a lot of these web app firewalls, they'll see login requests, and they'll be happening like within milliseconds of each other, coming from the same IP. Typically not a normal user action. So stuff like that, you can pretty easily determine when somebody's attacking. But honestly, there's so many automated scanners out there, you're going to see a lot of attacks.
Awesome. And this one's kind of, I mean, yeah, this one's kind of fun. Thoughts on hacking shows? Are any realistic, like Mr. Robot or the first 20 minutes of The Social Network?
Some of them are completely ridiculous. We make fun of them at work. Some of them are. I mean, some of them are relatively realistic, but most of them aren't. I mean, in the end, it's like, you know, they say what my boss thinks I do, what the world thinks I do, what the media thinks I do. And it's like, you know, you're in a hoodie and you're like, somehow you have broken the door down into the FBI and you now have access to everything. Well, sometimes that's the case, but typically that takes a long time to do. And most of the time it comes down to users doing things that are stupid. For example, we get into probably more than 50% of the networks that we get into for our clients are because somebody clicked on an email that they shouldn't have. They opened a document that they shouldn't have, or they visited a link. We'll send them a link to Netflix, looks just like Netflix, and then they put in their username and password, and they're using the same password on their Active Directory as they are on Netflix. So they're using their password all over the place. They're somewhat realistic, but no, mostly unrealistic. Most of the time it's just me sitting here staring at a screen. So not as action-packed as media makes it out to be.
Cool. And then I think this one's super fun. How did you yourself get into this field? What was your path?
So I was a web developer for several years. I did outsource programming for a bunch of different companies. So I did a lot of different types of languages. And then when I was doing my master's degree, it was Scholarship for Service, which is federally funded for cybersecurity. So I did 20 hours a week of work in a cybersecurity lab, and I already had a passion for web. And so I kind of went the route of looking into web vulnerabilities. And then when I got hired on with the Department of Defense, that's what my group did. So we helped people, well, I should say military networks and government networks that looked like they had been hacked. I looked into those, and then I did a lot of malware analysis that used web vulnerabilities. And my job was to come up with mitigations or fixes for different web vulnerabilities. I ended up taking some classes specifically for web pen testing just because I think it's really interesting. Really interesting because I loved making web apps, but when I was making web apps, I had no clue about security. Once I started learning about security, I thought, I wonder if all those apps that I made were secure. And so I ended up doing a lot of research into it. And then I got hired on with Synac, their red team, probably 2.5 years ago. And it was just really interesting being able to go into actual companies like production websites, like credit card companies and big banks and stuff like that. Like, I have a credit card for this company and I'm testing their site. It was just really cool to be able to do stuff like that. So I did it as a hobby, and then my current job now, basically I got hired specifically to do that full time, which has been great.
All right. So this is a question that I've personally, because I almost decided to go to security in college myself. Hi, I'm Ty, the lead TA.
All right.
what are your thoughts on the old boys club that is the ISE squared / the CISSP title itself?
So I'll tell you that my master's degree director for my security program, he was on the ISC Square board, and he really encouraged us to get the CISSP and the SSCP and the Security Plus and all of that. I think that certifications are good, but I don't know that they're necessary to do. I think it's great if you can learn everything and pass the test. They're pretty expensive, and they require you to pay dues every single year. So I passed all of the exams, but I haven't really had anybody ask me on a job interview if I have one, and maybe it's just because I've got a lot more experience. I think in the end, if you have a good, solid background in something and you've got a lot of experience and you've published, if you write blogs and things like that, that somebody could look to and know, oh, you actually do know what you're talking about. That's what people care about in the end. The cert is supposed to signify that, but if I took the cert 10 years ago and I've just been paying the maintenance fees, who knows if I've been doing it for the last 10 years. So I don't know. I think that they are definitely worthwhile if you're just breaking into the industry. But if you can get in some other way that doesn't require you to get the cert, it's definitely a lot cheaper to not do it.
Okay. Sorry for the dig on the ISC squared.
That's right.
Let's see. So I guess that brings to John's question. Are there any certs that are really highly regarded in the field? And is there research into machine learning that's used to find and filter out malicious requests?
Well, so SANS, SANS, they offer a lot of different courses, and they have a lot of different certifications. Honestly, I've never done any of them. There's the Certified Ethical Hacker certification, which I have also not done. I think in the end, you can be, if you want to really get into this field, it takes a certain mindset. You can learn how to do specific things, but if you don't have the right mindset, just as an example, so I love programming. I can program all day, right? Prior to this job, that's all I did pretty much, is I was a programmer. And when you're doing that, typically you have a goal. So it's like, I need you to make a button right here, and I need this button to do this very specific thing. When I click this button, it's always supposed to do this, whatever it is. So you have your goal, and you say, okay, well, I need to do exactly this. And you write it, and you make it do that. But with security, it's like, all right, here's a website. See if there's any vulnerabilities in it. And you're like, you have no idea what if there's any vulnerabilities. You have no idea where the vulnerabilities are going to be. And so it can be pretty stressful. I'll tell you that you get a new site. I mean, we do pretty much one every week, a new site. And at the beginning of the week, you're like, I have no idea what's going to happen with this site. I don't know what language it's coded in. Is it .NET? Is it React? Is it Gem? Is it Ember? Is it Django? Is it, any name a ton of them, right? You have to be able to learn new languages. Just did one the other day with GraphQL. I'd never even heard of it, honestly, but I had to do a lot of research to figure out how to get more information than I was supposed to using the API, the documentations. You end up reading a lot of documentation for a lot of different libraries. So yeah. I kind of forgot what the original question was. Sorry. What was
How
the
often, how often do you get to play with Splunk? Sorry, this is a personal question.
So I don't use Splunk now. I have used it in the past, but the machine learning piece, so I did remember, machine learning piece, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe some of the scanners that have come out have been doing some work with that. I'm sure some of the web application firewalls might be incorporating some machine learning. I think Mandiant, FireEye, um, a lot of the big Gartner Magic Quadrant security companies that put out all these security products, they probably try to do machine learning. And I know that there's jobs out there for doing programming with security. That's an awesome thing if you can get into it. If you can get into a company that does security, creating security products. But Splunk is one of them. I mean, Splunk is used by a ton of people for security specifically. I've got a lot of friends that do Splunk all the time. But it can get pretty expensive if you meet the limits on their thresholds for data size. It can get really expensive really quick.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. There's a thin client question, and then there's a Kaspersky question. Which one do you want first?
Kaspersky, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, typically, so I worked with the government, right? And typically they wouldn't just say, don't use them unless there was actually a pretty solid reasoning for that. I don't know. That's pretty much all I can say about that.
Okay, here's the actual question. Kaspersky just got busted for phoning home to Putin. Any recommendations on security apps for our own machines, Windows, Linux, and Mac?
So, honestly, Windows Defender, it's built in with Windows 10. Microsoft in general, they have been doing a better job than most companies in the past 5 years. I mean, they got a bad rep, I guess, in the past for getting pwned so frequently. But honestly, they have done a 180, and they are big into security. And I was just at Black Hat, Las Vegas. We teach a course at Black Hat for network pen testing. And I went by one of the booths of a really cool, I was like, hey, this is a cool product. And apparently they just got bought by Microsoft to be incorporated into Windows Defender for free. And it's going to allow you to do a bunch of log aggregation and analysis and everything that's going to be rolled out sometime this year. I don't use any third-party vendors for that type of stuff, but I will say if you run Mac, you should, I want to say, let me see if I can find, if you have a Mac, you should go to this guy's site, Petrich. What is his site? Objective-C. This guy is one of the senior researchers at SYNAC, and he does a lot of research into Mac-specific malware. He's the one that found Fruit Fly recently that was just a spying piece of malware that's been out for like 5 years. It activates people's cameras and their microphones. And he has products, and all of these are really cool, and they're all free. I've put all of these on our Mac, our iMac that we have here at our house because my wife uses it. But like, for example, ransomware, this one or lockdown, I can't remember which one, but basically if it sees that files on your system are being systematically encrypted, it will block the process and then prompt you and say, hey, I see a process that's encrypting files on your machine. Do you want to continue to allow it to run? So like ransomware that actually encrypts all of your stuff, this will block it. It also notifies you when any process turns on your mic, turns on your webcam. He's got things to go through for Mac malware that's persistent. You drop it into specific directories. Some of these will go through all of those directories looking for different files that aren't signed by a verified Apple verified certificate. And then, so anyway, I would suggest that everybody go and download these if you run Mac. If you run Windows, just don't open anything that you don't trust explicitly. I mean, honestly, most of the time, I will open things in a VM. If it's something like even a URL that I get sent by somebody that's got extra stuff on it, if it's just the URL itself, I'll probably just browse to it, not click on it at all. But typically, I have a VM, and I will open stuff in a VM just because there's so many ways to compromise machines. And Windows has a much larger attack surface because it's more used in the world. Mac is getting a lot more malware and a lot more attacks specifically for Mac because Mac has a larger, is growing in user base, and they honestly have not been doing as good of a job on security as Microsoft, which doesn't seem like that would be the case because they're always saying they're much more secure, but they have not done as good of a job with their security on Mac OS as Windows is doing as Microsoft is doing with their Windows products.
I just wanted to. All right, so I think I think that's all the time we have. I did want to ask you, how often do you guys bring up XKCD comics at your workplace? Or you're not allowed to?
Frequently. I mean, we're all nerds. We're usually just working the whole time. Our sales guy will do that.
Oh, fair enough. All right, Bobby Drop Tables. I think everyone knows that.
Yeah. You got a shirt that says that.
Cool. Well, Hans, I think I speak for everyone when we say that this was probably one of the more fruitful and exciting presentations we've had as far as the topic, and we feel like I didn't even get to scratch the surface for all the questions that have come in. So I feel like we definitely could have you back talking about other specific things later on in the future. But yeah, for now, I guess I can tell the students go back to work and Hans get back to breaking into people's sites so that we can, be safe when we go and use all the apps that we continue to use. So we really appreciate the work that you do and your field. And for those that are really interested, feel free to reach out. Hans is a part of our Slack community for however long he wants to be. So you're welcome here at Lambda School forever. And yeah, I know when I have questions, I'll just go knock on your door.
Right.
So, but yeah, if they ever want to reach out, if they do reach out, if you don't want to communicate, want to respond, it's completely up to you. But if we do, do you have a Twitter account or Twitter handle that students?
I do.
Okay.
My Twitter handle is Petrich.
Okay.
And I'd recommend reading the blog post that I've written. Shameless plug for myself, but it's. Let me see if I can put this just in the Slack channel here. If I put is it going to? It's basically the exact same. Oh, that's putting the space in it. Anyway, my Twitter handle, putting it in the Slack thing, it's just it's Petrich.
I got your back.
With the @ symbol. So
Don,
there you go.
All of us. So cool. All right. Well, we'll stay in touch, and yeah, once again, we really appreciate this. I feel like we could teach a whole course on this. It's amazing stuff. So,
sure. If you ever want me to come back, just let me know.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Yeah, now get back to work, students.